History remembers the gowns and the glory, but it often forgets the cruelty. In the winter of 1894, at the height of the London season, a social execution was planned. The victim was Lady Eleanor Vance, a woman stripped of her title and fortune, invited to a grand supper only to be destroyed. The plan was simple: humiliate her until she fled. But her tormentors made one fatal calculation. They didn't account for Julian Thorne, the Duke of Ashbury, a man who had never broken a rule in his life until the moment he saw her standing alone. This is the true, untold story of the scandal that brought the British aristocracy to its knees. The invitation had been a mistake. Eleanor Vance knew this the moment her boots touched the gravel of Oakhaven Manor. The rain was falling in sheets, turning the immaculate drive into a slurry of grey mud, a fitting reflection of her own reputation. She did not arrive in a carriage, emblazoned with a crest, but in a hired hackney that smelled of damp wool and old tobacco. Inside, the manor was a fortress of gold leaf and velvet. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pheasant, beeswax, and the sharp, metallic tang of judgment. Eleanor handed her coat to a footman who barely made eye contact. She smoothed the front of her dress. It was a dove-grey silk, remade 3 times over, the lace at the cuffs fraying just enough to be visible to the sharp eyes of the peerage. She was the daughter of the late Earl of Vance, a man who had gambled away 3 estates and then had the indecency to take his own life, leaving Eleanor with nothing but his debts and his shame. She had been invited to Oakhaven by Lady Genevieve, the hostess, under the guise of family charity. But as Eleanor entered the drawing room, the silence that rippled through the crowd told a different story. They were sharks, and she was the blood in the water. "Eleanor," Lady Genevieve purred, gliding forward. She wore crimson, a colour that cost more per yard than Eleanor had lived on for a year. "We didn't think you'd actually come. How brave." "You sent for me, Genevieve," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. "You said you had news regarding my father's papers. Later, darling. Dinner is served." The doors to the great hall were thrown open. The guests filed in, a parade of titles and jewels. There was Lord Pembroke, whose eyes lingered too long on the maids, the elderly Marchioness of Hale, who knew everyone's secrets, and at the far end of the procession, Julian Thorne, the Duke of Ashbury. He was the most powerful man in the room, perhaps in all of England outside of the royal family. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his black tailcoat. His face was harsh, composed of sharp angles, and a jawline that looked as if it were carved from granite. He was known as the Iron Duke, unyielding, cold, and utterly uninterested in the frivolous games of the ton. He walked alone, acknowledging no one. Eleanor lowered her gaze. Years ago, before the fall, she and Julian had danced once. He had been kind then, or as kind as a statue could be. Now he was a stranger, and she was a pariah. The guests moved to the long mahogany table. It was set for 30. Crystal goblets sparkled under the chandeliers. Place cards with calligraphy swirls dictated the hierarchy of the evening. Eleanor waited for the crowd to settle, looking for her name. She walked the length of the table. Left side? No. Right side? No. The guests took their seats. The scraping of chairs against the parquet floor ceased. 30 guests, 29 chairs. Eleanor stood near the center of the room, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. The realization hit her like a physical blow. There was no place card. There was no chair. A titter of laughter broke out from Lady Genevieve's end of the table. It was a planned excision, a public statement that Eleanor Vance no longer had a seat at the table of society. "Oh dear," Genevieve said, her voice ringing clear in the silence. "It seems the staff has miscounted. How dreadful. Perhaps, Eleanor, You might take a plate in the kitchens. The staff eats at 8. The humiliation burned hot in Eleanor's throat. She could feel the tears pricking, the urge to turn and run, to flee into the rain and never return. She looked around the table. Lord Pembroke was smirking. The Marchioness was studying her fan. Not one person moved. Not one gentleman offered his seat. They were all complicit. Eleanor took a breath, preparing to bow her head and accept her exile. Then, a screech of wood against wood shattered the silence. At the head of the table, Julian Thorne stood up. The movement was violent, sudden. The Iron Duke rose to his full height, dominating the room. His expression was thunderous. He did not look at Genevieve. He looked straight at Eleanor. The room gasped. A duke never rose once seated, not unless the Queen herself had entered. Julian picked up his own heavy oak chair. With effortless strength, he carried it around the table. The sound of his footsteps was the only thing heard in the cavernous hall. He stopped directly beside where he had been sitting, placing the chair on his right-hand side, the position of highest honor. He looked at the footmen who were cowering against the wall. "Bring another setting," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Now!" Then he turned his dark eyes to Eleanor. He extended a hand, his palm open, a gesture of absolute respect. "Lady Eleanor," Julian said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, silencing the whispers. "None here are worthy of your company. Sit here beside me." Genevieve's face went the color of ash. "Your Grace," she stammered, "that is the seat of honor. It is reserved for whom I choose," Julian snapped, not breaking eye contact with Eleanor. Eleanor walked toward him. Her legs felt like lead, but she held her head high. As she reached him, she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, an anchor in the storm. He waited for her to sit, pushed her chair in, and then, and only then, did he resume his seat. "Now," Julian said, picking up his wine glass and casting a cold, terrifying look down the length of the table. "We shall dine." The first course was turtle soup, but to Eleanor it tasted like nothing. Her senses were entirely focused on the man beside her. Julian Thorne didn't speak immediately. He ate with mechanical precision, his presence acting as a shield that deflected the venomous glares shooting from the other end of the table. The social order of the dinner had been shattered. By placing the disgraced Eleanor at his right hand, Julian had elevated her above a countess and 2 marchionesses. It was an insult to them, and a declaration of war against Lady Genevieve. "You are trembling," Julian murmured. He did not look at her. He was cutting a piece of bread. His voice was so low, only she could hear it. "I am terrified," Eleanor whispered back. "You have made a scene, Your Grace." "I merely corrected an error in the seating chart," he replied dryly. "And I have told you before, Eleanor. Call me Julian." The use of his given name sent a shock through her. It had been 5 years since they last spoke properly. 5 years since the summer at Lake Como, before her father's scandal, when a young, less guarded Julian had read poetry to her by the water. She had thought he had forgotten. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "They will say you have lost your mind." "Let them talk. Sheep always bleat when the wolf walks by." He turned to her then, his dark eyes searching her face. "Did you really think I would sit by and watch them feed you to the dogs?" "I thought you were one of the dogs," she admitted. A shadow crossed his face. "I suppose I have earned that." Across the table, Lord Pembroke, a man with a face like a squeezed lemon and a reputation for cruelty, leaned forward. He had consumed 3 glasses of wine and felt brave. "Tell us, Lady Eleanor," Pembroke sneered, his voice loud enough to pause the conversation. "How is your father? Or rather, how is his legacy? I hear the creditors are still selling off the family silver. Is there anything left? Or are you here to sell the jewelry off your neck?" The table went silent. This was the attack they had been waiting for. Eleanor gripped her silverware. The necklace she wore was a fake, glass beads strung on wire. The real Vance diamonds had been sold 3 years ago to pay for her mother's funeral. Before she could answer, Julian placed his wineglass down. The sound was a sharp clink that resonated like a gunshot. "Lord Pembroke," Julian said. His tone was conversational, which made it all the more terrifying. "I was reviewing the investment logs of the East India Company last week. I noticed a substantial withdrawal from your accounts. A gambling debt in Monte Carlo, was it not?" Pembroke paled. That is private business, Your Grace." "Is it?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "I thought we were discussing financial embarrassments. If we are to discuss the Vance estate, surely we should discuss the mortgages on your own properties in Kent. I hear the roof at Pembroke Manor has not been repaired in a decade because the funds were diverted to other interests." Pembroke's mouth opened and closed like a fish. He shrank back into his chair. Julian turned back to his meal. "The pheasant is excellent. Don't you agree, Eleanor?" Eleanor stared at him. He had just publicly blackmailed a peer of the realm to defend her honor. "Excellent," she breathed, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of tension. When the final course was cleared, and the ladies were signalled to withdraw to the drawing room while the men smoked, panic flared in Eleanor's chest. She could not be left alone with Genevieve and the other women. They would tear her apart. As she stood to leave, Julian stood as well. "I find the air in here stifling," Julian announced. "Lady Eleanor, would you do me the honour of showing me the gallery? I understand the Oakhaven collection is unique." "But the men are to smoke, Your Grace," Genevieve protested, her voice shrill. "It is tradition." "Tradition," Julian said, offering his arm to Eleanor, "is often just an excuse for bad behaviour. Come, Eleanor." She took his arm, and they walked out of the dining hall, leaving a room of stunned aristocrats in their wake. They walked in silence until they reached the long gallery, a hallway lined with portraits of dead ancestors. The rain lashed against the high windows. Once they were alone, Julian released a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. He turned to her, and the mask of the Iron Duke slipped. He looked tired and intensely focused. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "Eleanor, listen to me carefully. You were not invited here for charity. You were invited because Genevieve knows you have the key." Eleanor frowned, stepping back. "Key? I have nothing, Julian. They took everything." "Not everything," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. It was old, yellowed, and bore the seal of her father. "Your father didn't just lose his fortune, Eleanor. He was robbed. He was building a dossier on a syndicate of men who were manipulating the grain markets. Pembroke, Genevieve's husband, half the men at that table, they were involved." Eleanor felt the room spin. "My father, he wasn't just a gambler. He was a gambler, yes, but he was also a threat to them. They drove him to ruin to discredit him before he could go to the crown." Julian stepped closer, his intensity magnetic. "I have been trying to prove it for 2 years, but I need the ledger." The ledger he mentioned in his final letters. He said he gave it to his greatest treasure for safekeeping. Eleanor's hand went to her throat, to the cheap glass necklace. "I don't know what you mean. I have no ledger." "Think," Julian urged. "Not a book, a location, a code, Anything. Eleanor's mind raced back to the night her father died. The chaos, the bailiffs. He had hugged her, smelling of brandy and despair. He had whispered something. "Look to the North Star, Elle. It always leads you home." She looked up at Julian. "The nursery," she whispered. "In our old estate. There was a loose board under the telescope. He called it the North Star." Julian's eyes blazed. "That estate is now owned by Lord Pembroke. He bought it at the auction." "Then it's gone," Eleanor said, defeated. "No," Julian said. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "Pembroke is hosting a masquerade ball at that very estate in 3 days. We are going to go." "I cannot go back there," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "And certainly not with you. The scandal—" "There is already a scandal," Julian interrupted. He reached out and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed her skin, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Let's give them a scandal worthy of the history books. We are going to retrieve that ledger, clear your father's name, and bring every one of those people in the dining room to justice." "And why?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "Why risk yourself for me?" Julian paused. He looked at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Because, Eleanor, at that supper, when I saw you standing there, I realized that I have spent 5 years regretting the fact that I didn't offer you a seat in my life. I am not making that mistake again." The moment hung suspended between them, fragile and electric. But before Eleanor could respond, the heavy oak doors at the end of the gallery creaked open. "There you are," a voice hissed. It was Lady Genevieve. She stood in the shadows, her eyes gleaming with malice. I knew it. Plotting in the dark. Julian stepped in front of Eleanor, his posture shifting instantly back to the impenetrable Duke. "We were discussing art, Genevieve," Julian said coolly. "Specifically, the art of the counterfeit." Genevieve smiled, a razor-thin expression. "How fitting, because I have just sent for the constable. It seems a diamond brooch has gone missing from my chambers, and the only person who was upstairs unattended was Lady Eleanor." Eleanor gasped. "That is a lie." "Is it?" Genevieve stepped into the light. "We shall see what is found in your pockets, my dear." Julian's hand found Eleanor's in the dark, squeezing it hard. "Stay close to me," he whispered. "The game has begun." The gallery air, previously cold and still, now felt suffocatingly thick. Lady Genevieve stood with her arms crossed, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips as the murmur of the dinner guests spilled into the hallway. They had abandoned their port and cigars, drawn by the scent of catastrophe like moths to a flame. "You cannot be serious," Julian said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. He stepped fully between Eleanor and the growing crowd, shielding her with his broad back. "You accuse Lady Eleanor of theft? Here? Now?" "I accuse her of opportunity," Genevieve replied smoothly. "My sapphire and diamond brooch, the heavy one from the Romanov collection, was on my vanity not an hour ago. Eleanor was seen coming down the servants' stairs. Who else has the motive? She is destitute, Your Grace. Desperation makes thieves of us all." Lord Pembroke pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with wine. "Search her!" he bellowed. "Turn out her pockets. If the Vance girl has sticky fingers, we shall call the magistrate and have her in irons by midnight." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The humiliation of the empty chair at dinner was nothing compared to this. To be physically searched, touched by these people who loathed her, was a violation she could not bear. "I did not take it," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "I have taken nothing from this house but insults." "Then you won't mind emptying your reticule?" Genevieve challenged, extending a hand. 2 burly footmen stepped forward, their intent clear. Eleanor flinched. "Stop!" The word was not shouted, but it cracked through the room like a whip. Julian Thorne did not move, but the air around him seemed to freeze. He looked at the footmen, and they froze in their tracks, terrified by the sheer lethality in his eyes. "If any man lays a hand on Lady Eleanor," Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "he will lose that hand." He turned his gaze to Genevieve. "You wish for a search? Very well. But we shall do this according to the law. If you accuse a guest of the Duke of Ashbury, you accuse the Duke himself. If she is to be searched, then I shall be searched. And if I am searched, then every person in this room shall be searched." Julian took a step toward Pembroke. "Starting with you, my lord. Shall we empty your pockets? Shall we see what promissory notes or illicit letters you are carrying tonight? I recall you have a fondness for carrying opium tins." Pembroke sputtered, clutching his coat. "That is preposterous. I am a peer." "And she," Julian roared, his control finally snapping, "is a lady, and you will treat her as such." He turned to the head butler, a man named Silas, who looked ready to faint. "Silas, did you check the conservatory, specifically the potted fern near the east window?" Genevieve's eyes widened imperceptibly. "The fern? I saw Lady Genevieve admiring it earlier," Julian lied. He hadn't seen any such thing, but he knew Genevieve's type. She wouldn't destroy the brooch. She would hide it nearby to retrieve later, ensuring it was found only after Eleanor was ruined. Perhaps the brooch fell. Silas scurried off. The silence in the hallway was agonizing. Eleanor stared at Julian's back, marveling at the tension in his shoulders. He was gambling everything on a bluff. Moments later, Silas returned, pale and trembling. In his white-gloved hand lay the glittering sapphire brooch. "Found, my lady," Silas squeaked. "In the soil of the fern," just as his grace suggested. The room erupted into gasps. Genevieve looked as though she had been slapped. She snatched the brooch from Silas, her face a mask of fury. "It seems," Julian said, his voice dripping with disdain, "that gravity is the only thief here tonight. Or perhaps clumsy fingers." He turned to Eleanor, offering his arm once more. "Come, Eleanor. This house is unclean." They walked out of the manor, past the stunned guests, past the mud-spattered carriages of the gentry. Julian's personal carriage, a sleek black brougham with the Ashbury crest in silver, pulled up. The footman opened the door, and they climbed into the velvet-lined darkness. As the carriage lurched forward, leaving Oakhaven and its cruelty behind in the rain, Eleanor finally broke. She didn't weep. She simply began to shake, the adrenaline leaving her body in violent waves. Julian moved instantly. He abandoned his seat opposite her and sat beside her. He unclasped his heavy wool cloak and draped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight. "Breathe," he commanded gently. "It's over. You are safe." "They hate me," she whispered, clutching the lapels of his cloak. It smelled of cedar, rain, and him. "They truly hate me. I didn't realize how deep it went. They don't hate you, Elle. They fear you." Julian took her hands, rubbing them to bring back the warmth. "They fear what you represent. The truth about how they made their fortunes. That scares them more than any poverty." Eleanor looked up at him in the dim light of the carriage lamps. His face was shadowed, but his eyes were fierce. "You lied back there, about the fern." "I made an educated guess," Julian corrected. "Genevieve is not creative. She pulls the same stunt with her maids whenever she wants to dismiss them without pay." "You saved me," she said softly. "Again." "I told you," he said, his voice dropping to a huskier register. "I am done watching from the sidelines." The carriage hit a rut, jostling them. Eleanor fell against him, her shoulder pressing into his chest. She didn't pull away. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. She felt the solid, beating heart of a man who was willing to burn down society for her. "The masquerade," Eleanor said, pulling back slightly to look him in the eye. "At Pembroke Manor. If we go, if we are caught, it won't be a social execution, Julian. It will be prison. Trespassing. Theft." "Then we better not get caught," Julian said, a reckless grin touching the corners of his mouth. "Tell me about the nursery. Tell me everything." 3 days later, Pembroke Manor was a beacon of light in the dark English countryside. Hundreds of carriages lined the drive. The estate, which had once been the ancestral home of the Vances, had been transformed into a grotesque display of Lord Pembroke's new wealth. Gold bunting hung from the stone lions Eleanor's grandfather had carved. The fountains flowed with wine, and inside 500 guests moved like a river of silk and satin, their faces hidden behind masks of velvet, papier-mâché, and feathers. Eleanor Vance stood at the edge of the ballroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was unrecognizable. Julian had procured a dress for her from a Parisian modiste in London, a gown of midnight blue velvet, so dark it looked black, dusted with tiny crystals that caught the light like stars. On her face, she wore a sleek, black domino mask that covered her eyes and nose. She was no longer the disgraced Lady Eleanor. She was the knight. Beside her stood Julian. He was dressed entirely in black, his mask a terrifyingly simple piece of black iron that covered the upper half of his face. He looked like a phantom, a shadow detached from the wall. "Steady," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Do not look at the walls. Do not look at the portraits. If you look at the past, you will trip." "It's hard," she admitted. "That vase. My mother bought it in Florence. That rug. I learned to walk on it." "Focus on the mission," Julian said. "The nursery is on the 3rd floor, east wing. Correct?" "Yes, but the stairs will be guarded." "Not the servants' stairs. Pembroke is cheap. He won't have hired extra staff for the back corridors." Julian offered his hand. "Dance with me first. We need to be seen, so we can disappear." They stepped onto the floor. The orchestra struck up a waltz, Strauss's Blue Danube. Julian pulled her into his arms. His grip was firm, possessive. As they swirled into the mass of dancers, Eleanor felt a strange dichotomy. She was in the home she had lost, dancing with the man she had loved from afar, surrounded by enemies. It was exhilarating. "You dance well for a man made of iron," Eleanor teased, breathless as he spun her. "I had a good teacher once," he replied, his eyes locking onto hers through the mask. "A girl in a white dress, by a lake in Italy. She taught me that music was for feeling, not counting." Eleanor's breath hitched. He remembered. "Julian," she warned, "we cannot—" "I know," he cut her off, pulling her closer than propriety allowed. "But tonight, in these masks, we are no one. We are just a man and a woman. And I intend to enjoy this dance." For 3 minutes, the world fell away. There was no scandal, no ledger, no debt. There was only the heat of his hand on her waist and the swirl of the blue velvet. But as the music swelled to a crescendo, Julian's tone shifted. "Spin toward the pillar," he commanded softly. "Now." He twirled her toward the edge of the room. As the song ended and the guests applauded, Julian and Eleanor slipped behind a heavy velvet curtain and into the servants' corridor. The noise of the party faded instantly, replaced by the smell of dust and neglect. "This way," Eleanor whispered. She hiked up her heavy skirts and ran. They climbed the narrow, winding stairs. The house, so loud below, was silent and ghostly up here. Pembroke clearly didn't use the third floor. The air was stale, and cobwebs draped the corners. They reached the heavy oak door of the nursery. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the knob. It was locked. "Allow me," Julian said. He pulled a thin metal pick from his glove, a tool that a duke should certainly not possess. With a few deft movements, the lock clicked. They slipped inside and closed the door. Moonlight streamed through the large bay window, illuminating the room. It was a graveyard of Eleanor's childhood. A rocking horse with a missing ear stood in the corner. A dust sheet covered the small bed. Eleanor felt a sob rise in her throat, but she swallowed it. "The telescope," she said. "It used to be by the window. The telescope was gone, sold off likely, but the circular mark on the floorboards remained." "Here," she said, kneeling. The North Star. Julian knelt beside her, ruining his immaculate trousers on the dusty floor. "Which board?" "This one." She pointed to a short plank that looked identical to the others. "My father showed me the trick. You have to press the knot in the wood." Julian pressed his thumb against the knot. A soft click echoed. One end of the board popped up. Eleanor's heart stopped. She reached into the dark cavity beneath the floor. Her fingers brushed against something cold and leather-bound. She pulled it out. It was a black ledger, wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the damp. "Is that it?" Julian asked, his voice tight. Eleanor unwrapped it. She opened the cover. In her father's erratic, desperate handwriting, she read the first entry, September 12th, 1890. "Meeting with Pembroke and the syndicate. They intend to corner the wheat supply. They have threatened my family." "It's everything," Eleanor breathed, flipping the pages. "Dates, amounts, names. He wrote it all down. Julian, this proves it. Pembroke didn't just bankrupt him. He blackmailed him into silence and then destroyed him." "We have them," Julian said, a savage satisfaction in his voice. "We have them all." He stood up and extended a hand to help her. "Come, we need to get this to my solicitor tonight." But as Eleanor stood, a sound froze them both. Footsteps. Heavy, purposeful footsteps coming down the hallway. Not a servant. "Did you hear that?" A voice boomed. It was Pembroke. "I heard a noise from the old nursery." "Probably rats, my lord," another voice answered. Genevieve. "Rats don't unlock doors," Pembroke growled. The handle of the nursery door jiggled. "Locked," Pembroke muttered. He threw his weight against it. "Who is in there?" Eleanor looked at Julian, panic wide in her eyes. They were trapped on the third floor. There was no other exit. Julian looked at the window. It was a sheer drop to the stone terrace 3 stories below. "Hide the ledger," Julian whispered. "In your bodice. Now." "What are we going to do?" Eleanor hissed. Julian grabbed a dust sheet from the old furniture. He looked at her, his eyes apologetic but determined. "We are going to cause a diversion," he said. "Trust me." "Open this door," Pembroke shouted. The wood splintered as he kicked it. Julian pulled Eleanor behind a large wardrobe just as the door flew open with a crash. Lord Pembroke stood there, holding a candelabra, with Genevieve and 2 large groundskeepers behind him. They peered into the gloom. "I know someone is in here," Pembroke yelled. "Come out!" Julian stepped out from behind the wardrobe. He had removed his mask. He had also unbuttoned his shirt halfway and messed up his hair. He looked not like a thief, but like a lover interrupted. "Good God, Pembroke," Julian drawled, sounding annoyed and breathless. "Does a man have to buy the estate to get a moment of privacy?" Pembroke's jaw dropped. "Your Grace? Ashbury?" Genevieve peered around him. "Julian, what on earth are you doing in the nursery?" Julian reached back and pulled Eleanor out. She had followed his lead. Her mask was off. Her hair was deliberately dishevelled. She clutched Julian's arm, looking appropriately scandalized. "We were reminiscing," Julian said, giving Pembroke a knowing, rakish look. "Lady Eleanor was showing me her childhood home. One thing led to another. I'm sure you understand, Pembroke. The heat of the moment." The tension in the room shifted from danger to scandalous shock. To find the Duke of Ashbury trysting with the disgraced Eleanor Vance in a dusty nursery wasn't a crime. It was the gossip of the century. Pembroke stammered, lowering the candelabra. My apologies, Your Grace. I thought it was intruders." "Just lovers, my lord," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk. He pulled Eleanor closer, shielding the bulge of the ledger in her dress. "Now, if you don't mind, we would like to return to the ball, unless you intend to watch." Pembroke turned beet red. No, of course not. Please, proceed." He stepped aside. Julian guided Eleanor past them. His face was calm, but Eleanor could feel his heart hammering against her arm like a trapped bird. They walked down the hallway, past the stunned Genevieve, who looked as if she had swallowed a lemon. They didn't speak until they were back in the noise of the ballroom, and then out the front doors, and finally, safely inside Julian's carriage. As the horses thundered away into the night, Julian collapsed back against the seat and let out a roar of laughter. "I cannot believe that worked," he gasped. Eleanor pulled the ledger from her dress, her hands shaking. "You told them we were lovers. To save the book." Julian stopped laughing. He looked at her, the adrenaline fading into something softer, more intense. The carriage was dark, intimate. "I didn't lie, Eleanor," he said quietly. Eleanor froze. "What?" "I said I didn't lie," Julian repeated. He reached out and took the ledger from her, setting it on the seat. Then he took her face in his hands. "I have been in love with you since the day I met you at Lake Como. I was a fool to let you go then, and I would be a damned fool to let you go now." Eleanor's breath caught. "Julian, I have nothing. I am a pariah. You have this," he said, tapping the ledger. "And by tomorrow morning, you will be the woman who brought down the corrupt lords of London. But even without it, you are the only one who has ever made me feel like a man, not a title." He leaned in, his eyes searching hers. "May I?" Eleanor closed the distance. The kiss was desperate, fueled by fear and triumph, and 5 years of silence. It tasted of the cold night air and the promise of a new dawn. For a moment, the conspiracy, the danger, and the ruin didn't matter, but the world outside was not done with them yet. As the carriage slowed to turn onto the main road toward London, a sudden, violent jolt threw them apart. The carriage screeched to a halt. Gunshots rang out. "Get down!" Julian shouted, throwing himself over Eleanor. The door was wrenched open. A man in a rough coat stood there, a pistol levelled at Julian's chest. It wasn't a common highwayman. It was Pembroke's head of security. "The ledger!" the man snarled. "Hand it over, or the Duke dies first." The barrel of the pistol gleamed in the moonlight, steady in the hand of the hired thug. Inside the carriage, time seemed to warp, stretching into a terrifying eternity. Eleanor felt the cold leather of the ledger pressing against her thigh, the evidence of a lifetime of pain. "I won't ask twice," the man growled. "The book. Throw it out." Julian did not move his hands from where they hovered near his shoulders in surrender, but his eyes were calculating, shifting from the gunman to the open door, then to the horses. "If I give you the book," Julian said, his voice unnervingly calm, "Lord Pembroke will still order you to kill us. A dead duke is a tragedy. A live duke is a witness. The gunman hesitated. That split second of doubt was all Julian needed. With a roar, Julian kicked the carriage door. It swung outward with violent force, slamming into the gunman's knees. The man howled, the pistol discharging harmlessly into the night sky with a deafening crack. "Jump!" Julian shouted, grabbing Eleanor's waist. They threw themselves out the opposite door just as the carriage horses, spooked by the gunshot, bolted. The carriage careened down the road, dragging the swearing gunman, who had gotten tangles in the reins, along with it. Eleanor hit the wet grass hard, rolling to absorb the impact. The velvet gown was heavy, instantly soaking up the mud. She scrambled to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Julian was already at her side. He winced, clutching his left arm. Blood was seeping through the sleeve of his coat, a graze from the bullet or a tear from the fall. She couldn't tell. "We cannot stay on the road," he gasped, looking back toward the lights of Pembroke Manor on the distant hill. "He will have men on horseback. Within minutes, we have to go into the Blackwood." The Blackwood was a dense, ancient forest that bordered the estate, known for poachers and treacherous ravines. "Into the woods!" Eleanor cried, looking at the impenetrable wall of trees. "In this dress?" "Unless you wish to return to the ballroom in chains," Julian said, gripping her hand. "Run, Eleanor!" They plunged into the trees. The canopy blocked out the moonlight, plunging them into near total darkness. Branches whipped against their faces, and brambles tore at Eleanor's expensive gown. She didn't care. She lifted the skirts high, the ledger clutched to her chest like a shield, and ran. They ran until their lungs burned, and their legs felt like jelly. Behind them, the distant sound of shouting and the baying of hounds drifted on the wind. Pembroke had unleashed the hunting dogs. "Here," Julian whispered, pulling her down into a ravine hidden by overgrown ferns. An old gamekeeper's shack, long abandoned, stood half-collapsed against a rock face. They scrambled inside. The roof was half gone, but it offered shelter from the wind. Julian collapsed against the rotting wall, sliding down until he hit the dirt floor. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him. "Let me see your arm." "It's a scratch," he gritted out. She ignored him, ripping a strip of silk from her petticoat. In the dim light, she saw a jagged gash on his forearm from a rock during the fall. It was bleeding freely. She bound it tight, her hands surprisingly steady. "You were right," she said softly, tying the knot. "About the danger. I didn't think he would go this far." "Men like Pembroke believe they own the world," Julian said, watching her face. "When you threaten that ownership, they become animals." He reached out with his uninjured hand, touching her cheek. "I am sorry, Elle. I promised you a dance, not a manhunt." Eleanor leaned into his touch. The chase had stripped away the last of their pretenses. There was no duke, no outcast lady. Just two people fighting for survival. "You saved my life," she said. "And back in the carriage. Did you mean it? What you said about loving me?" The forest was silent, save for the dripping rain. Julian looked at her, his expression stripped raw. "I have measured every woman I have met against you for 5 years," he said, his voice low and intense, "and they all fell short. When I saw you at that table, treated like a beggar, I wanted to burn the house down. I don't just love you, Eleanor. I breathe you." Eleanor let out a ragged sob. She kissed him then, not with the desperation of the carriage, but with a slow, aching tenderness. It was a promise. If they survived the night, they belonged to each other. A howl cut through the moment. The hounds were closer. "We have to move," Julian said, struggling to his feet. "They've found our scent." "We can't outrun dogs," Eleanor said, panic rising. "No," Julian agreed. but we can confuse them." He led her out of the shack toward the stream that cut through the ravine. "The water will hide our trail. We follow the stream north. It leads to the rail lines." They waded into the freezing water. It was torture, the cold biting into their bones, but they trudged upstream for a mile, slipping on mossy rocks. Finally, the trees thinned. Ahead, the silhouette of the Ashbury station signal box stood against the greying dawn sky. "The mail train." Julian checked his pocket watch, the glass cracked but ticking. "It passes at 5 a.m. It stops for water." They scrambled up the embankment. As they reached the gravel of the track, the ground began to vibrate. The whistle of the train pierced the morning air. "Hey, you there!" A shout from the tree line. Pembroke's head of security had anticipated the move. He rode out of the mist on a black stallion, leveling a rifle. "Stop the train and you die!" the man yelled. The train was thundering closer, slowing down for the water tower. "Do you trust me?" Julian yelled over the roar of the engine. "Yes," Eleanor screamed. "We don't stop it," Julian said. "We jump." As the mail train chugged past at a slow roll, Julian grabbed the handle of an open cargo car. He swung himself up, groaning as his arm took the weight, and then reached down. "Elle, take my hand!" Eleanor sprinted alongside the moving metal beast. The gunman fired. A bullet sparked off the wheel next to her head. She lunged. Julian caught her wrist. With a heave of hysterical strength, he pulled her up. She tumbled onto the floor of the cargo car, landing on sacks of flour. Julian rolled the heavy sliding door shut, plunging them into darkness, just as another shot pinged harmlessly off the metal exterior. They lay there in the dark, covered in mud, flour and blood, panting in unison as the train picked up speed, carrying them toward London and toward justice. London in the rain was usually a dreary affair, but to Eleanor Vance, the soot-stained buildings looked like salvation. They went straight to Julian's townhouse in Mayfair. The servants were shocked to see the Duke and the disgraced Lady Eleanor arriving in the back of a coal cart, having bribed the train conductor, looking like shipwreck survivors. But there was no time for baths or rest. "Send for Sir Arthur Conan," Julian barked at his butler, "and get the editor of the Times, now." While Julian met with his legal team, Eleanor sat by the fire in his library, the ledger on her lap. She refused to let it go. She traced her father's handwriting, finding strength in the ink. "I do this for Eleanor," one entry read, "so she may walk with her head high." By noon, the storm broke. Lord Pembroke had not been idle. Realizing his thugs had failed, he had taken the offensive. He had filed an emergency writ with the High Court, accusing Julian Thorne of abduction of a vulnerable woman and theft of private property. He was trying to use the law to silence them before the ledger could be verified. At 2:00 p.m., a summons arrived. They were to appear before the Lord Chief Justice immediately. "He wants a public spectacle?" Julian said, reading the summons while a valet shaved him. "I shall give him one." 2 hours later, the Old Bailey was packed. Word had spread like wildfire. The Duke of Ashbury had been summoned like a common criminal. The gallery was filled with the very same peers who had shunned Eleanor at dinner days before. They whispered behind fans and monocles, hungry for blood. Lord Pembroke stood at the plaintiff's table, looking immaculate and aggrieved. Lady Genevieve sat behind him, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. When the doors opened and Julian entered, a hush fell. He wore his formal ducal regalia, sash, medals, and the heavy chain of office. On his arm was Eleanor. She had bathed and dressed in a gown Julian's sister had left at the house years ago, a structure of white silk and gold thread. She looked like a queen returning from exile. She did not look at the floor. She looked straight at the judge. "Order!" The Lord Chief Justice banged his gavel. "Lord Pembroke, state your grievance." Pembroke stood, his voice trembling with faux outrage. "My lords, I stand before you a victim. The Duke of Ashbury, in a fit of madness, trespassed upon my home, assaulted my staff, and abducted Lady Eleanor Vance, a woman of unstable mind who I was trying to care for. Furthermore, they stole a ledger of sentimental value from my late friend, the Earl of Vance." The crowd murmured. Unstable mind. It was a clever trap. If Eleanor was deemed insane, her testimony, and the ledger, would be dismissed. "Lady Eleanor," the judge looked down his nose. "Do you claim you were abducted?" Eleanor stepped forward. She released Julian's arm and stood alone in the center of the court. "I was not abducted, my lord," she said, her voice ringing clear off the stone walls. "I was liberated." "Liberated?" Pembroke scoffed. "From whom? Your family friends?" "From my father's murderers," Eleanor declared. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged the gavel furiously. "Silence, Lady Eleanor. That is a grave accusation." "And I have the proof," she said. She produced the black ledger. This book contains the records of a syndicate known as the Grain Trust. For 10 years, they have artificially inflated the price of wheat, starving the poor of London to line their own pockets. My father discovered it. He tried to stop it, and for that, he was driven to suicide. "Lies!" Pembroke screamed, losing his composure. "That book is a forgery. She wrote it herself. She is a hysteric." "Is she?" Julian's voice cut through the noise. He stepped forward. "If the book is a forgery, Lord Pembroke, then why does it contain the banking codes for your private accounts in Zurich?" Julian turned to the gallery. "I have spent the morning with the governor of the Bank of England. We used the codes in this book. We found £3 million sterling hidden in offshore accounts. Accounts opened the very week the Earl of Vance died." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. £3 million was a fortune beyond comprehension. "This is preposterous," Pembroke sputtered, sweating profusely. "You cannot prove those accounts are mine." "We don't have to," Eleanor said. She opened the ledger to the final page. "Because my father was not just a gambler. He was a meticulous man. He had every member of the syndicate sign the initial charter." She held the book up. "Is this not your signature, Lord Pembroke? And yours, Lord Hale? And yours, Sir Thomas?" She pointed to men sitting in the gallery, the very men who had sat at the dinner table and watched her humiliation. They shrank back in their seats, faces pale as ghosts. "The signature is witnessed," Eleanor continued, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed, "by the justice of the peace, who happens to be your brother-in-law." The room descended into chaos. The judge was shouting, but no one was listening. Pembroke looked around wildly. He saw his allies turning away, saw the police constables edging closer to the railing. He realized the game was over. "She's a witch!" Pembroke shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Eleanor. "She seduced the Duke. She poisoned his mind." "She saved my soul," Julian said, stepping between Pembroke and Eleanor. He looked at the judge. "My lord, I submit this ledger as evidence A. I also submit myself as a witness to the attempted murder of Lady Eleanor Vance by Lord Pembroke's men on the road to London last night." The judge looked at the ledger, then at the sweating, dishevelled Pembroke, and finally at the stoic Duke. "The court accepts the evidence," the judge ruled, his voice grave. "Constable, take Lord Pembroke into custody, pending a full inquiry into the Grain Trust." "No, you can't," Pembroke cried, as 2 officers grabbed his arms. "I am a peer of the realm." "And you are a thief," Eleanor said softly, watching him be dragged away. Lady Genevieve stood up, looking to flee, but Julian caught her eye. "And you, Genevieve," Julian called out. I believe there is the matter of a false accusation of theft regarding a brooch. I shall be filing a suit for defamation of character against you. I suggest you find a very good solicitor." Genevieve fled the courtroom, burying her face in her shawl amidst the jeers of the crowd. Eleanor stood in the center of the storm, her legs finally trembling. It was done. Her father's name was clean. Her tormentors were broken. She felt a hand on her waist. Julian was there. "It's over," he whispered. "Is it?" she asked, looking up at him. "The scandal. They will still talk. I am the woman who dragged the peerage through the mud." "Let them talk," Julian said, loud enough for the gallery to hear. He took her hand and raised it to his lips. "Let them say that Lady Eleanor Vance is the bravest woman in England. And let them say that she is the future Duchess of Ashbury." The gallery went silent, then erupted into applause. Not the polite, stifled applause of a dinner party, but the raucous, genuine cheer of a crowd that loves a victory. Eleanor looked at Julian, tears finally spilling over. "You are sure?" "I come with no dowry, Julian, only a scandal." "My dear Eleanor," Julian smiled, the rare, breathtaking smile that transformed his iron face. "You offered me a seat at your table when I had nothing but a title. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never stand alone again." Spring arrived early in 1895, washing away the mud of a bitter winter. On the morning of the wedding, the sun struck the spires of Ashbury Cathedral with a blinding gold. The pews were packed, not just with the peerage who now clamoured for the Duke's favour, but with the common people, the farmers and millers whom Eleanor's father had tried to protect, and whom the Grain Trust had tried to starve. Eleanor stood at the altar. She did not wear the grey silk of her poverty, nor the borrowed gown of her trial. She wore white lace, commissioned from the very weavers her father had supported in his life. When Julian turned to her, the Iron Duke was gone. In his place was the man who had carried a heavy oak chair through a silent room to save her dignity. As they knelt to exchange vows, the silence in the cathedral was not one of judgment, but of awe. Julian leaned in, breaking protocol one last time before the Archbishop could speak. "Look up," he whispered. Above the altar, depicted in the ancient stained glass, was a single, bright star guiding a ship through a storm. "The North Star," she smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "It finally led me home." "No," Julian corrected, squeezing her hand tight as the organ music swelled. "You were the star, Eleanor. You shone when everything was dark. I was just the man lucky enough to look up." They walked out into the brilliant sunlight, not as a duke and a scandal, but as a husband and wife who had brought the aristocracy to its knees. And later that afternoon, at the wedding breakfast, there were no empty chairs, no whispered insults, and no exclusion. There was only a seat of honor, right beside the Duke, where Eleanor Vance would sit for the rest of her life. And so, the scandal that threatened to ruin Lady Eleanor became the very thing that saved her. It is a powerful reminder that history is not just made by those with titles and power, but by those with the courage to speak the truth when the room goes silent. Eleanor Vance taught London that dignity isn't something you are given by a hostess, it is something you carry inside you. And as for the Duke, he proved that true nobility isn't about bloodlines. It's about who you are willing to stand up for. If this story moved you, if you cheered for the Iron Duke and the fearless Lady Eleanor, please take a moment to hit that like button. It helps us bring more of these hidden historical romances to life. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a scandal. and I want to know your thoughts. Drop a comment below. If you were at that table, would you have offered Eleanor your seat? I'll see you in the next chapter of history.